So my name is Becky Welzenbach. I'm a librarian at the University of Michigan, and I'm the program manager for Lever Press. Hopefully, if you're on this webinar, you're familiar with what Lever is, but I'll just give a tiny summary. It's a consortium of libraries, most of you, all from liberal arts colleges, who have joined together to launch a scholarly press that is digital first, open access, and specifically engaged with the values, the focuses, foci, and the ethos of liberal arts colleges. This is the second one of these webinars that we've offered. Back in December, we introduced where we were with our Fulcrum platform that's being developed here at Michigan Publishing. And the topic of today's session will be on peer review and the way that Lever Press is seeking to make a very particular sort of intervention in that space. Before I introduce our speakers and get us going, I want to just run down a couple of logistics. First, I want to thank Terry Fischel, John Meyerhofer, and Ron Joslin from Macalester College. They've arranged for this webinar and done all the sort of technology and administration on the back end, so thank you to all of you. And they're monitoring and helping. So Ron is already chiming in with folks having trouble in the chat, so Ron's your helper. I want to mention that this session is being recorded and we'll distribute it afterward, so please just be aware of that. All of you are muted by default, so please stay that way. I think you don't have power to undo that, but that will help us avoid any sound issues. And as you have questions or comments or ideas, please use the chat box, which many of you are already finding. If you hover, again, near the bottom of your screen or perhaps up at the top, depending on the layout that you're using, you should see an icon to take you to the chat, and we'll use that space to share resources, but also to hear your comments. There's also a Q&A icon where we can gather questions. Everyone's already using the chat, so we may just stick there, but if anyone puts questions in the Q&A, we'll be monitoring that as well to make sure we get to those questions during the second portion of the workshop, the webinar. And I think that's it for logistics. Our speakers for this session are two representatives from Lever Press. Mark Edington is already on the line. He's the publisher of Lever Press and the director of Amherst College Press. And our other panelist is Jason Mittell. He should be joining us at any time. I think he was in transit today and will be here shortly. He's professor of film and media studies and American studies at Middlebury College, and he's a member of the Lever Press Editorial Board. So Mark and Jason will each give their perspectives on this question of peer review. And then I have a couple of prepared questions that I'm going to ask them to engage with, and then we'll turn to the questions that all of you have.
Great.
Before we start, I thought it might be helpful to just quickly give a little overview of the structure of Lever Press in case the context is helpful. Most of you are representatives of pledging libraries. There are 54 in all participating libraries, although that shakes down to actually about 45 pledges. Some of you are in groups like the Claremont colleges, several colleges bundled together as a participant. And the pledging libraries are really the foundation of this entire initiative. The pledging libraries have the ability to nominate and then to elect librarian representatives. These are usually library directors who make up our oversight committee. The oversight committee is responsible for sort of strategic governance of the press, fiscal responsibility, sustainability, and just the overall running of the initiative, the long-term strategy and vision. The other sort of core part of the governance of this press is the editorial board. The editorial board is made up of faculty invited from the pledging institutions, of which Jason is one, and there are several others as well. Faculty can be nominated from pledging institutions, and they're ultimately selected and invited by the oversight committee with an eye toward a balance of disciplines and different representation of colleges across the board. And then the third part is our operations group made up of staff from Michigan Publishing and Amherst College Press. That's me and Mark basically, and with some help from our colleagues. And so we're responsible for making the editorial work happen and the production work as publications will be coming through the pipeline. Today we'll be mostly focusing on work carried out by the editorial board. They're sort of the gatekeepers, the representatives who are responsible for the reputation of the press as an academic institution. So giving the green light to publications that have been peer reviewed and come through the pipeline, and ensuring that our press is rigorous and reliable. So one of the first things that they turned to was this question of peer review, and that's how we got to where we'll start from today. So I think with that, I will just hand over to Mark.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks so much, and thanks for organizing this webinar. We're so glad to have so many people participating. This is really an important part of what we're trying to do to make Lever Press a truly membership-based organization and to keep our participating libraries engaged and feeling like they're part of the work and kept current about what we're up to. So I'm really happy that so many people are joining us. I'm speaking to you from the editorial suite of Lever Press here in Amherst College, and I'm really happy to be talking with you today about peer review. So I'm going to try to start this off by sharing my screen, which is going to just take me a little minute here. I think this is going to do it. And I hope now that you're going to see a blank white screen for a presentation. So let's start with this question. Why does it matter that we are focusing on peer review? We are a scholarly press. We claim to be a scholarly press. We know what it means to be a scholarly press. AAUP, the Association of American University Presses, makes it pretty clear what that means. It means that you have a rigorous way of doing peer review in the work that you publish. We do that in the same way every other press does. So why should we bother to be very transparent about what we're doing in peer review and talk about it with all of you? Well, the most important reason is that open access has a reputation problem. And I think all of us who have been on the barricades trying to get open access made more of the standard for scholarly communication are aware of this problem. So if you can read articles in The Economist, and if you can hear stories about hoaxes that are launched with open access journals, if you can find articles in the New York Times or in the New Yorker about the problem of sort of pay-for-play journals in the world of science dealing with scholars who are so eager to get published that they'll pay the money on the claim that there's a peer review process in place and then find that actually none of the people on the editorial board knew they were there, we have a problem. And it's obviously somewhat in the interest of those publishers who are for-profit publishers and who are making good money with the system as it now exists to make this reputation stick. In fact, it's now the case that today my very favorite webcomic, XKCD, actually runs a funny little comic about this sort of problem. And if you don't know it, I encourage you to look it up. But basically what we're dealing with is this basic idea: open access somehow means not peer reviewed. And we need to clearly say that this is just false. We can argue this at every conference we go to, at every panel we're invited to be part of. We can make the case that there's no iron law of nature that relates a review process to the way in which materials are released at the end of publication. But ultimately, the best way for us to address this problem is through transparency and not through argument. So imagine 17 years ago that you were in Tempe, Arizona, and you were at a meeting on emerging systems of scholarly communication. You would have been part of writing a document that issued this statement: the system of scholarly publication must continue to include processes for evaluating the quality of scholarly work, and every publication should provide the reader with information about the evaluation the work has undergone. As I say, that's part of a document known as the Tempe Principles, and if you look it up online, you can find it. It's a document made available through ARL. But think about that statement for a minute. We all know that what it means to be a scholarly work is to be reviewed, but when was the last time you read a book from a university press that told you with any specificity what review process the book had undergone? We know how to do this in the world of rights, right? Because we're all familiar with the Creative Commons system. In the old days, we used to just do it this way on the copyright page. We would say who owned the rights to the intellectual property of the work, and that would tell you kind of who you had to deal with if you wanted to make use of the work inside in some way. Now we have this wonderful system given to us by the Creative Commons folks of signaling to users what uses they can make of a work that's been published. They need to say who it's by. They need to share alike the work they create in making a quote or making a derivative use. They can't make a commercial use of what they use. They can't make a derivative. All of these things are clear ways of signaling to users and scholars what they can do with the works that they've found on library shelves or on the web. So what if we could imagine a world in which we did the very same thing with peer review? Or even better, what if we could imagine a world in which we did something like this with peer review, first making clear what were the materials that we reviewed? Did we review the entire manuscript? Did we review a proposal and then the entire manuscript? We could say things like, this manuscript was subjected to a single blind review, pretty typical in the world of scholarly presses, that the reviewers knew who the author was, but the author is not informed who the reviewers were. That's why you get that thanks line to anonymous reviewers for their insights and critique. Or we could say things like, the proposal of this work was subjected to a double-blind peer review, but the manuscript itself was part of a peer-to-peer review process. That might be more typical for a collection of an edited volume, say. Or we could say that the manuscript itself was first double-blind peer-reviewed and then subjected to an open review process. And that would be the little icon that would appear in Cathleen Fitzpatrick's work, Planned Obsolescence, which many of us sort of regard as a standard for how open review can work. Or in the social sciences, we could say the manuscript was reviewed in a single-blind process, but the data set was reviewed in a more stringent way, in a double-blind system. What we're saying is that we need to be clear about what we're reviewing and how we're reviewing it, and we need to have a way of signaling what those processes are. So the Lever Press Editorial Board, which is pretty remarkable as a group of faculty, they're incredibly engaged and incredibly thoughtful about the challenges that we need to face in making this system work. They've said that we've got to do three things. We've got to be clear what we mean by different forms of review. What does double blind mean? What does peer-to-peer mean? What does open review mean? And then we have to say clearly, what is the object that we've reviewed? Is it a manuscript? Is it a proposal? Is it something between those two things? Have we reviewed all of the media that's been submitted as part of the work? And finally, we have to be clear what process have we used for what object and why. We have to be willing to disclose what we've done and why we've done it. And in doing this, we're kind of challenging other presses to do the same. So now I'm going to hand off to Jason Mittell at Middlebury, and what you've got on your screen is the peer review commitments and guidelines document that our editorial board, of which Jason is a part, has developed and published. Jason?
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to wherever you are and joining us. Just to build on what Mark said, I mean, this is something that when I decided to be on the editorial board of Lever, this was the opportunity that I was most excited about, was the ability to participate in new forms of publication, not just for this individual press, but to set models. And I think that the issues that Mark said, the sort of big problem that he laid out that we were trying to solve involves the reputation problem of open access, which I think is real and important, and I'm very happy about that. I want to think about another problem, which is also we're trying to address here, which is a crisis of peer review, of what peer review means. And this goes beyond just the realm of scholarship. It goes beyond the entire, our entire system of factuality and truth right now is under threat. And obviously the open access web is a big part of that someone can post anything online, and it's very difficult to know to what degree was that vetted and what standards are being held. So I think that as scholars and as publishers and as librarians, we all are invested in trying to make some review system or set of systems functional and reliable. And following what Mark said, the big tenet I think that is in front of us is transparency. And to be able to have a model like we've laid out with these icons and with this very transparent system, what we're signaling is not just to say our little open access press does things this way, but to ask the question, so what do all those books that may be on your shelf do? How are those peer reviewed? I think we all, depending on our field, depending on the publishers we've worked with or that we're reading, have a sense of, yes, we know that these things were peer reviewed, and they were peer reviewed through some sort of black box. But we trust that the name of the publisher will assure us that the black box was functional. So Harvard University Press, we assume they have a great black box because of their reputation. And commercial press may have a less great black box. And then a so-called predatory press, example I'll use is David Publishing, which is an online open access press that sends a lot of emails to people asking them to submit to journals you've never heard of. We assume, as Mark suggested with some of those anecdotes in the press, that their black box is more or less empty, or at least not very functional. But we don't know, right? So this is one of the big problems. We don't know the processes that went into this. So how can we signal what is in our black box? And in some cases, that can mean just being very clear through the icons as to, there were 2 reviewers, it was double blind, they reviewed this. That reveals a lot about the black box. It doesn't tell us what they said, and it doesn't tell us who they were, but it reveals a lot more than what we know right now in pretty much any journal or manuscript publisher out there. We just don't know what system they use. We can also think beyond that to say, well, how might peer review function as something that adds to our understanding of knowledge and our understanding of scholarship? So I'm involved with a project called In Transition. In Transition is a journal of video essays that publish in the field of film and media studies, which is my main field. And I'll put a link here in the chat. In Transition, our main goal as a press as a journal was to try to validate video essays as a form of scholarship. And what we saw in our work is it's no problem getting a video essay published. All you need is a YouTube account. What the hard thing to do is to get a video essay validated as something more than just a YouTube video. So the solution to that problem was to embrace open peer review, where we not only have works published in the form of video, we always publish at least 2 reviewer commentaries that are signed and open, so that those peer reviews help set the dialogue in the field as to this is what makes this scholarship acceptable, this is what validates it, this is why it's unique to the form, etc. So I think for areas of new knowledge production and new forms of knowledge dissemination, it's really important to think about the function of peer review not just as the black box says this is good, but here's some of the content from the black box to understand why it's good. This is going to help validate this form. So at Lever, we've done 2 main things. We've said that we are going to be hyper-transparent about what form of peer review we will use, and we will be flexible to work with authors and editors to figure out what form of peer review is going to serve the specific needs of this project. So for a manuscript that looks a lot like a book, but has digital multimedia capacity, traditional single blind review of a manuscript may be completely appropriate and the most useful thing for that field. But for a project that does push the boundaries in new ways, that even the fact that we have a black box that says we did peer review, that may not be enough to explain why. So there, a system of open review or peer-to-peer review might be much more important. So allowing that flexibility for authors and editors to embrace new forms is, I think, another key asset that we bring to the table. And then in the long term, I think what we would like to see is that these are not unique to Lever Press. So we are creating these icons in this system, but in the spirit of Creative Commons, we are opening them for people to poach and to draw upon and to transform in the way. Personally, I would love if all of these books on my shelf behind me each had an icon, so I knew what went into making this a publication. And hopefully that will be sort of one of the takeaways of the innovations that Lever Press is bringing to the table.
Great. Thank you both so much. This was really interesting. And so as I mentioned, I have a couple of questions ready that I'd like to ask you, and then we'll shift over to questions from the general audience. So first, I wondered if, Jason, you could say a little bit more, or Mark too, actually, both, either of you, more about the process. How did we arrive at this set of guidelines for Lever Press, and what was that like?
So I'll start out and then Mark can pick it up. So this was one of the charges in our first editorial board meeting, was to figure out how to make Lever Press's reputation be legitimized, right? And obviously having partner institutions like we have, many represented here today, is one part of that, but peer review was obviously another big part of that. And I think that in those meetings, it was just put on the table, what can we do here? And as we started talking, it became clear that one of the features of our editorial board and our editorial project is we are non-disciplinary. So the board spans a lot of different disciplines. So we have, I'd say most people are from humanities and social sciences. We actually do also have a physicist. We have historians. We have, language scholars. We have film and media. We have a history of science. We have a lot of different fields represented. And as we started talking, it became clear that when we say this is peer reviewed, we all had different ideas as to what that meant. So what that indicated and proved, I think, to the room was we can't just say we're peer reviewed. We have to say how we're peer reviewed. So that led to this conversation of how can we be transparent. And then Mark and I this has been a sort of pet project of mine outside of Lever. We started this conversation and came up with this idea of using Creative Commons as the iconic model for what we're doing. And Mark can add to how he got to the icons that he has now.
So yeah, I'll just add to that. That's a great summary, Jason. The icon idea basically comes to us from Creative Commons, and the thing that's really appealing to, I think, both Jason and I and a lot of other people about this idea is what Creative Commons has done is successfully create a way of signaling some pretty complex and dense ideas in a very clear little way. So as you all know, behind that icon, there is sort of plain language about what that license means. And then behind the license, there's machine readable language that basically librarians can quickly identify work as open access in their catalogs. So we'd like to be able to do the same thing. In my ideal world, librarians would routinely catalog scholarly work in ways that would indicate right in the cataloging record both the right status and the peer review status of the work that they're cataloging. And that's a sort of utopian idea, but what we're really trying to do, I see a question in the chat room about, what are the best practices for engaging more traditional fields that have this sort of attitude about, well, we love your work, but if you don't publish with one of the following 3 presses, we're just not going to promote you. Well, the best thing we can do is to say, well, what do you think the standards of review are in those places? And why is it not the case that an equivalent process of review gets us to the same level of quality? So that's one answer. And the other answer is, while all this is happening, I hope you all know that we're busy engaging with presidents and provosts and department chairs and deans about the work we're doing to try to open this question and engage them in a conversation about moving the needle on the acceptance of open access work.
Great, thank you. Next question from me is, about a year ago, the American Association of University Presses published a best practices for peer review handbook, and I can put the link to it in the chat in just a second. So given that relatively new resource is out there, could you speak to how these guidelines either build on that or distinguish themselves from it?
I can speak to that a little bit. The person who really should speak to that is another member of our operations team, and that's Mary Francis, who's the editorial director at Michigan and who was on the committee that drafted the peer review guidelines. I think the thing I'd say is the guidelines from AAUP sort of look at the range of practices across the world of university presses and talks about how, in many cases, these things that are kind of shrouded in the mists of process, and Jason's wonderful phrase, the black box, are very contingent, are very context dependent, don't always look the same everywhere. For example, a really important distinction that you should be aware of is most scholarly presses in the UK, that's a generalization, but it's generally true, accept work on the basis of a very well-developed proposal, contingent, obviously, on the response of an author to the critique of reviewers, but the contract is issued at the proposal stage. For American presses, it's a little bit different. So there's a range of practices out there. That's kind of what is documented by the AAUP report. What we're trying to do is say clearly what we stand for. What do we mean by these various forms of review, and how are we applying those forms of review to the work that we publish? So it's a little more specific. We're trying to just very transparently take the ideas of that report and apply it to our case.
Great, thank you. And a third question, and then I think we'll go to the chat box because a lot of great questions are coming in there. But I guess this might be best suited for Jason. As a scholar and as a teacher, what support do you think that authors need and that students need from libraries or from presses to understand and navigate this landscape as they're trying to either publish their own work or do good research themselves?
Yeah, it's, I mean, so from the perspective of teaching and students, I love Mark's idea of having metadata about peer review being baked into catalogs and databases, because this is, I think, one of the huge crises that most faculty who were trained in another era of publishing, we just don't know how to teach students how to vet what they're looking at, right? Because on the one hand, you know, there was a wave at first where we just said, well, if it's published online, it's not reliable. And then obviously that crumbled away when we realized, well, everything is now published online, so that's not a meaningful distinction. And then there was the, well, if it's only if it's from a real press, but now we have presses that look a lot like real press. And we can't expect the average 20-year-old to understand the difference between, you know, a press like, I'll mention Bloomsbury, which is a commercial press, but I think a very valid, legitimate press, and David Publication, which is a commercial press, which is not. And how can we expect a student to understand that difference, right? And that's really the job of faculty and librarians to help signal that difference, but we don't have an easy way to do it, especially since a lot of faculty don't even know the differences in this way. So having transparent peer review will help with that. Having that transparency reflected in some of the systems at play, like metadata and catalogs, I think would be hugely, hugely helpful from that perspective. On the other side, in terms of the mechanics of academia, one of the sort of mantras that I think we always have to remember is that the logic of academia is that change is a threat. And, you know, so anything that's new and different is always seen as skeptical in terms of our process, not necessarily in terms of the ideas, but in terms of our processes of doing things. So if we are trying to do something new, there's always going to be resistance. So I think it's really important for those of us who are involved in these innovations to take leadership roles in our local campuses, to take leadership roles in our societies and scholarly societies. And if your university has a university press, to reach out to the press in this way, to try to sort of change the culture and make people understand this is not saying we want to get rid of peer review. This is saying we want to explain what that is and be flexible about it as on a case-by-case basis. So I know that the idea, like the question that was raised earlier of, you know, there being these presses and these journals that count and then these ones that don't is ingrained in a lot of fields and a lot of institutions. And I think the best way we can do is just to keep pushing on that, to ask why and get people to challenge those assumptions. To think, well, maybe the reason why I assume that these are valid is based on how things worked 25 years ago. So pushing on that from the inside of institutions, the inside of societies. And societies actually are a really great place for making these change happen. A lot of societies have put out best practice statements in terms of open access and digital publishing, and are very, very accepting and highlighting the idea that these are not sort of brand new uncharted territories, but rather adaptations of existing practices. I know, I mean, Mark mentioned Cathleen Fitzpatrick, and I think she's a great ally. I've collaborated with her on a number of projects, and she's very much interested in this project. You know, for those who don't know her, she's the Director of Scholarly Communication for the MLA, which is one of the largest scholarly societies and certainly one of the most influential in book publishing. And I think that having a big organization like MLA behind these efforts will help change the visibility and the understanding of it.
Great, thanks. So I think what I'd like to do now is tackle some of these questions from the chat and just make sure we're getting through them. So the first one that came in was from Shannon Keeley, and that was the one about approaching academic departments. And I think Mark and Jason have both spoken to that a little bit now, so I think maybe we'll go on to the next. Amy Filia-True asked, I am interested in the process you use to find and engage reviewers and manage the process of peer review from a logistical standpoint. Do we use software to do this, and do we have staff dedicating it? Mark, do you want to take this, or do you want me to join you, or how do you want to go about it?
You'd be the best response on the software side. You want to try that?
Yeah, sure. So we've thus far been using a Google form to receive proposals from authors who would like to work with Lever Press, and we're just about to, I'm sort of putting the final touches on it, shifting over to a tool called Submittable. And this is one that we've used at Michigan Publishing for a few years now with our journals, and it works pretty well. So we're going to be trying to use it with Lever as well. So again, so far that's been just for submission, stuff coming in the door, but it can also be used to manage reviews and engage with reviewers and sort of take reviews into a system. And I think that may well be worth trying, although I will say just my experience kind of outside of Lever here at Michigan Publishing and with the U of M Press is that while that has worked really well for journals, our monograph editors have really preferred not to use a tool like that. For them, they see the peer review management process as just being so sort of high touch for monographs that they really just do it through email and phone calls. They prefer that direct contact with the reviewers. So we'll have to see. I think if we use a software system for Lever, it would just be building on the Submittable system that we'll be using for intake of manuscripts. But Mark may have other ideas about the best way for a monograph-like work to engage with reviewers.
No, it's a great answer, Becky. And I would just add to it that when we speak of acquisition editors in the world of scholarly publishing, those people, it's important to understand that what they are acquiring is not only the work of authors going and finding the great work, bringing it into the house, they're also acquiring the reviewers in a very important way. And as we begin our work as a press and develop our editorial program, one of the things we're doing as editors when we receive these proposals is that we're relying on our editorial board as a first sounding board. So like we'll get a proposal, we'll send it out to Jason and one other person on the editorial board and say, hey, what do you think of this? How does this fit in our overall vision of what we might be doing? And if the reply is positive, then we'll go down the road of working with that author to fully develop a proposal and receive sort of the pieces and parts of the work itself. And then we'll go down the road of trying to find the right reviewers. And at that point, we're also talking to our editorial board to get ideas about who might the best reviewers be. So it's a pretty involved process, but it's an important process for doing this work.
Okay, the next question is from Lisa Conathan. Are there other scholarly pressers also working toward greater transparency regarding review?
I mean, I would say from my perspective that, I think there are. I don't think that I haven't heard any that are scholarly presses the way that Lever Press is a press affiliated with, established university presses, like we are with Michigan and Amherst. I think that there are digital publishing sites that have been pushing this. The one I'm most involved with is Media Commons, which has, again, that's what Cathleen Fitzpatrick was co-founder of. I do think that there are certainly other places that, online journals that have embraced open peer review. And so open peer review, by the nature of making peer reviews open and published, is transparent about their process, right? So I haven't seen anyone who says, we are putting all of our peer review processes to make them highly transparent. And maybe there are examples and people know them. I'd love to see them in the chat. But I think that the idea that, doing innovative forms like open peer review moves the bar toward transparency. I would, certainly love to see a kind of traditional book publisher adopt this. So I think that once we have this system in place, and if we do it for, a round of manuscripts, and we feel like, oh, this is a good thing, we have partners in Michigan Press, and I think that many of us have affiliations with other presses that on the editorial board we've worked with, that we would push them and say, hey, do you want to include this on your copyright page? It's not that arduous a thing to just add to that page, right? But then what it does is it signals a commitment to transparency, and then legitimizes transparency as an ethos.
Yep, just echoing that. Just think about the numbers involved here. I think the problem for journals is a sort of sharper problem, and that's why I think we've seen more response in the world of journals. There's also just a vastly larger number of journals than there are presses. There are roughly 140 presses in the AAUP. There are thousands of journals. So we've begun to see a lot of experimentation in the world of journals. I've seen examples of journals that are disclosing the names of reviewers at the time of final publication. That's interesting. Or the name of the controlling editor, for example, of a work that's been published. I will just share a story that some of you may already know, because when I talked about this at the Library Publishing Coalition meeting and sort of threw these ideas for icons up on the screen, one of the questions from an audience member came from the director of a university press who sort of got it and said, this is interesting. I kind of like where you're going, but I have to say, I think if you did this, I would have to do it too. And my reply to that was, that's exactly the idea. So all we want is a level playing field, because we think if we get there, then we help to move the needle on the acceptance of open access at a faster rate.
Great, thank you. So question from Amherst Library. We have some support for the idea, which is great, but a question about concerns about the sort of reuse and or abuse of these logos. Might they be fraudulently adopted by some of these more questionable presses and thus discredit them? In other words, could these logos become automatically suspect and turn on us?
Yes.
Yes, the answer is yes. And first of all, I want to say I'm not asking myself this question here for the purpose of answering it. This is a colleague here at Amherst, but and the answer is yes, and I think that's a risk we're just going to have to deal with, in the same way that the Creative Commons logos can be abused by people who want to undermine that system and, for whatever. So like a question that we have sometimes wrestled with is, what if we release a work on the basis of a non-commercial use license that then is commercialized? Like, what do we do in that case? It hasn't happened yet, but it will, it certainly has happened in other cases. So I think it is certainly a risk. It's a risk that means we need to be aware of that possibility and monitor it. But I think it's overwhelmingly important that we do something constructive to clearly communicate the level and rigor of our peer review process to make this open access press thrive. So I think it's a risk worth running.
And I would just say from me, and I'm the, in the spectrum here, I'm on the sort of radical fringe of being really pro open peer review, which is certainly not the norm in any scholarly field. Open peer review is something that is harder, a lot harder to fraudulently adopt, because what you're doing is you're having people sign their names to their peer reviews and have that be public. So if a predatory open access press claims to be using double-blind peer review, which they already do claim, they could use our icon to signal that, and then it's just a different way of saying the same thing. But they can't claim to be using open peer review fraudulently without actually publishing those open peer reviews signed by reputable scholars. So for me, at least, if you put a scholar's name to something and it is not actually what they do, well, then that's something that you can litigate, and whether people will or not is another question, but that's at least something you can push back against and say, look, that is incorrect. But if they say, yes, our black box featured what we're saying it features, there's nothing you can do to dispute that necessarily. So open peer review is one way to solve that potential problem, but I understand that's a very big hill to push the boulder up.
Right.
Okay, we did get to Amy's question already, so I'll go on to the next one. And this is one, Terry and John both pulled this over from the Q&A box where Regina asked, are these review icons being used by Leverpress?
Yeah, and I answered that in the Q&A box, but I'll answer it here for everybody. And the answer is, we are committed to the basic principle of signaling the way in which we've conducted our review and the thing that we have reviewed. We're not yet committed to these specific designs. That's a work in progress. And we'll let you know when we've got it, because we're going to want to publicize it, and it will be part of everything we publish. So we'll get there, but we haven't yet settled on the specific designs. What we know we need to do is find a clear way to signal what's being reviewed and how is it reviewed. So that's the problem set we're in right now.
I was wondering, Mark, if you might want to respond to, there's another question in the Q&A from Regina that sort of follows up specifically that, and you may have an answer to that.
Okay, I'm quickly.
I'll read it to you. It just says, are you working with Creative Commons to design the icons? Is there a copyright issue that has to be worked out between Never Ambush and Creative Commons? And so if you want to say where that stands right now.
Regina, this is an excellent question. It's so excellent that today I have a call with the General Counsel of Creative Commons, and that will be a big part of the answer to the question of specific design intent and look. What we are obviously bringing to them from a collaborative point of view is an interesting question for them, which is, can we make a derivative use out of your intellectual property, which is kind of a meta level question for our friends at Creative Commons. We think that there are shared interest here between our press and Creative Commons is the more rapid and more full acceptance of open access work in the world of scholarly communication. Obviously, they have a world that's much larger than scholarly publishing, but it's really important to many of their founders that we find a way to make this the standard in scholarly communication. So the short answer is we are on the case, and we're having that conversation.
Okay, Shannon Keeley has asked a question that I hoped would come up. In fact, it's why I didn't ask it before. How do you identify potential peer reviewers, and is there a way for faculty to put themselves forward as potential reviewers?
Well, the traditional way, Jason, I want you to chime in on this too. I mean, the traditional way is that is a responsibility of a press, and specifically it's the responsibility of an acquiring editor. And very often there's a two sort of there are two pieces to that function. One is finding the reviewers, and the other is managing the process of the review. But that's a traditional press function. That said, we're a startup, and anybody who wants to help, I'm interested in talking to. So we hadn't thought about creating a portal through which people could volunteer themselves as reviewers. I see no reason why we couldn't accept those self-nominations. We probably wouldn't be in a position to take them all, because what we assign to peer reviewers is going to depend on the kind of work that comes through the door. But yeah, great idea, and I think the solution to that is a simple portal on our webpage to make that possible. And then we'll send out a note to all the librarians to say, hey, if you know faculty who want to be involved in this project, this is a great way to do it.
And I think and the editorial board, I think, is going to serve that liaison function to some degree. We haven't gotten to this point in our acquisitions process yet, but if there's a project that comes through, like I mentioned, where we span a lot of different disciplines. So if there's a project that comes through that we're saying, okay, now it's time to send this to peer review. We've agreed upon the form of peer review we want to do, and we need X number of reviewers. Then we would sort of brainstorm as a board. Who do we know who we think would be the right reviewer for this? And I think a lot depends not just on expertise in field, but also openness to publishing form. Because a lot of the works we will be publishing will not look like a regular book. And that's kind of the point, is that we have digital publishing capacities and we want to use them. So there will be some reviewers out there who will be expert in content, but very reluctant to endorse the form.
Yep.
Right? And I think that getting a sense of that, so we don't want to throw a great project to a reviewer who their reaction would just be like, I didn't like reading on a screen. they're not the right reviewer for us, right? So so trying to vet them in that regard is really important. So again, using our editorial boards, using our contacts at the various liberal arts colleges where we all work and that are subscribing institutions, I think is going to be really useful for that.
But I do think that a form is a great idea as a way to supplement that, and that's definitely something we can do. So I've written it down. Thank you for the suggestion. Okay, we have a couple of questions from Andrea Papas, and I think I'd like to take the second one first because it's closer to what we're talking about, and I think we can maybe follow up on the other one later or circle back to it if we have time. But so Andrea has put forward a comment really about open peer review and about the value of blind peer review and protecting the reviewer, meaning that people might be more willing to be very rigorous if they're not concerned about an awkward social encounter with the author.
Yeah.
I guess it's not a concrete question here, but would you guys like to respond?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. Having managed an open peer review journal for the past 3 years within transition, this is an issue. There's no doubt, and it's an issue that requires a culture change. You need to, if you are doing an open peer review, you have to figure out, well, what exactly does that mean? The way that we do it in transition is that the editorial board first will say, this submission meets our basic criteria. Then we will send it out to peer reviewers who we believe are going to be sympathetic to the topic and knowledgeable. They write their reviews and they are signed. And we have had pushback from some people saying, I do not want to write a negative review that is signed. We try to coach them on the way that this is the way in which scholarship works, right? That it's about being able to be open and providing constructive feedback. We do that in the classroom. We should do that in the publishing realm as well. And we've managed to convince some people, and some people say, no, I'm not willing to do it. If something is never published, those reviews are never seen besides from the editorial board, the submitter, and the reviewers, right? It's only in the case where something is published and thus it is seen to be high enough quality that these reviews are then made public. We allow and we encourage our reviewers to revise their reviews based on any revisions in the submission, but also to think about, this is really the statement I want to make publicly. And it's been interesting, some of those published peer reviews are critical. I mean, they say, this work has issues, and here are the issues, but its strengths outweigh those issues. And what's been really exciting is for a lot of people, this has led to great conversations, and it models the idea that scholarship should be a conversation rather than a series of monologues that no one listens to, right? Which I think a lot of journal publishing can kind of feel like that. I published my journal article, which is great, it's on my CV, and that's the only audience that matters, rather than I want to have a conversation about this work. So the fact that the conversation is happening sort of between the work and the reviews, our reviewers who buy into that are really into that mode of scholarly engagement. And it's interesting, the people who are resistant to it and the people who buy into it are completely unpredictable based on rank, based on type of institution, based on any other factor that you might think, oh yeah, senior scholars are going to be more confident in putting out something negative or things like that. We found that's not the case. We found it's very idiosyncratic. Some individuals feel really comfortable saying, I'm signing this and saying this work is unacceptable for these reasons. Where some people say, I refuse to publish anything that comments on this work with any sort of negative criticism. Even though I love this piece, I want to mention this one thing, but I don't want to put that in press. And so I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. And I hope it's a phenomenon that's changing the culture of what's acceptable public academic discourse.
Yep. I don't have a lot to add to that. I think it's an excellent, very full answer. Yep.
Okay. Leverpress projects, will they have CC licenses?
Yes.
Yes, and I think
and just to add to that, we have now developed a model contract that we are showing to authors to give them a sense of the way in which we're doing contracting with the projects we're bringing aboard. But the general rule of that is copyright remains with the author, and the work is licensed to us to be published in both print and digital forms under the terms of a Creative Commons license. So the answer is yes.
And I think that if I remember correctly, there are options so that if a author wants different forms of CC licenses, right, we can certainly talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
Okay, next question. There's a reproducibility crisis in the news, sort of the flip side of the last question. Do you think that more transparency about peer review, particularly open peer review, will encourage greater diligence in searching for methodological or statistical flaws? In other words,
Yes.
you want to be embarrassed as a reviewer that you missed something?
Yeah.
And this was something that we really, in developing Media Commons now, I think a decade ago, open peer review was kind of part of the DNA of Media Commons. And this was one of our basic ideas, that scholarly reputation is based solely on your original research that you publish, but it's not based on your work as a reviewer. And that's a problem, because those of us who have done reviews know that they can be very time consuming. They can be very intellectually engaging and really important. And it's really frustrating that you spend all this time writing something that then two people see, you know, an editor and an author. And so having it public allows your work to be validated in that way. And then the flip side, as this question, you know, addresses, is this idea of like, look, if I'm going to sign my name to a review that says this is legit, I better make sure it's legit, you know. And it's not just thumbs up or thumbs down. It's also, these are the ways in which I view it to be legit. So I think it would be really interesting. I'm not a social scientist or a scientist, so I can't speak to specific methods and reproducibility. That's not the world I live in. But I can imagine, you know, you could write an open peer review that lays out why you think this method is sound. And maybe that method turns out to be unsound, but not in a way that you said it was sound, if you know what I mean. So like, there are differences in there. And then what happens is then that open peer review gets thought about to think about, oh, okay, this peer reviewer didn't do anything wrong, but the tests that they were using fit this logic. And in this logic, it was sound. But there was another question that was never asked. And the absence of that question could suggest to a larger methodological blind spot in the field, or it could suggest to different subdisciplines or what have you. So I think that there's a really interesting possibility for the way that opening peer review could actually lead to intellectual and methodological advances in ways that, you know, we don't even know how that works now because it's all in the black box.
Right, right.
Okay, so the last message to appear in the chat is sort of a wrap up from Terry. Since we do have a couple of minutes, I want to just come back to the question that Andrea raised earlier, and maybe it's one best followed up on offline, but I'll just put it out there. How will LeverPress handle illustration-heavy books for which electronic publication rights can be extremely expensive? So permissions, especially, you know, perpetually, openly online, can just be a whole other story. How are we thinking about this problem?
So, Andrea, it's a great question, and I'm going to try to come to it really briefly. The brief answer is 90% of the answer to your question is in author education. It is in sitting down with authors at a very early stage in a project and explaining to them, if we're publishing an open access result, that has consequences for the beginning of the work itself, and it has consequences for the selection that you will undergo of the media that you want to bring in, your awareness of what the rights are with all of that media, and our ability to include it in the work. So you can triage the results almost. There is stuff that's in the public domain that we don't have to worry about. There's stuff that is clearly not in the public domain, and the purchase of rights to which would be exorbitantly expensive. And in a way, we don't have to worry about that either, because unless it's really critical to the work, we probably will counsel our authors not to use it. And then there's the stuff in the middle, and that's really where our time will be consumed because we'll have to understand what are the rights involved in this work, who owns them, and can we go to those rights holders and ask for an open access result license? Because we have to be very clear with the rights holders what our intentions are in the publishing of the work. when we think a work, a piece of media, an image, a video, whatever it is essential to the work and to the argument the author is making. And if we get into a place where we have some tensions around the use of it, then we come to the question of making a fair use defense. And we have had the conversation already within the councils of the Liver Press about when, under what conditions, we'll be willing to take the risk of sort of publishing a work on the basis of anticipating the need to make a fair use defense. But we're very aware of it. We think of the biggest part of the solution to this question lies in the education of authors, and that's on us. We have to do a great job of briefing our authors and our author teams at the very beginning of a project and working with them early in the process.
And I would just say, oh, sorry, do I have time to add something?
Yes, sure.
I would just say, again, I'm a film and media scholar, and the way in which it's fascinating to me, the way in which different fields and different sort of industries have dealt with these issues of rights, because so in film and media, we have a very robust tradition of fair use, both of publishing in print journals and books frame grabs from a film or television show, as total fair use, no permissions or rights needed, to now the Society for Cinema and Media Studies has a policy statement that says digital publication of a clip embedded in a online publication, even a commercial online publication, is considered fair use if there's a critical analysis of that clip. Compare that to art history, where you do have to buy these rights because of the history of the field and the institutions involved, museums, galleries, collectors, etc. It's a totally different animal. And I think that people always assume because film is the big industry and Disney is such a driver in copyright that things are much more restricted in terms of film, but actually they're not in terms of fair use. So I think that's a really interesting dichotomy that, again, just speaks to the role of author education.
And I just wanted to add that we're thinking about this from a technological standpoint too, as we build out the Fulcrum platform. One of our first use cases, actually the first sort of test case to go on the platform, was the supplementary material for a book published by Northwestern University Press that had to do with early Russian film. And that author did all kinds of negotiation with Russian museums and archives that are notoriously difficult to deal with, and was able to get permissions for a number of the things that she wanted to put online. And this is not a fully open access book, but the media resources are openly available. Anyone can get to them. And one of the key things there was that they wanted, they were okay with things being made available, at a certain resolution or in a certain way, but they were concerned about downloads, for example. They didn't want to enable that. And we're using a plugin called Leaflet. It's designed for maps, but we're using it for images and other things that tiles things in such a way that, if someone is really devious and they're going for it, they can probably figure out a way to make it happen. But it basically disables downloading of the image or the resource, so that we could make it visible within the constraints of the owning institution for that work. So it's something that I think is multi-pronged. There's technological support as well as author guidance and other elements that go into it. So we are at 12:59 now. There have been a couple of sort of wrap-up messages here in the chat box. Terry thanking everyone for participating, and I want to echo that. We thank you too. It's been a great conversation. Some links where you can follow along with Lever Press on social media, and email addresses for Jason, Mark, and myself for any questions or follow-ups that you might want to have. So again, thank you so much for spending your lunch with us if you're on the east part of the country, or your morning with us if you're farther west. And have a great rest of your week. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky.